All right, is that on? Yes? Cool. All right, good afternoon everyone. Thanks for coming along, and I hope you're all ready to learn how to write a gem or two. As mentioned, my name's Pat. That's me on Twitter. That's my blog, if you're so interested, but I'm hoping you're going to pay attention to me instead. And yes, I am Australian, but you've had some practice now of understanding Australians, so hopefully you'll all understand me just fine. Now, I've been writing gems for a few years, and I think it's pretty simple, right? I mean, all you need to do is use Ruby gems to publish your gem to Ruby gems. Oh, wait, maybe that's a little recursive. Let me try this again. You just need to use gem to publish your gem to Ruby gems. Wait, I think I've got it. Just use the gem command to publish your gem to rubygems.org. That's a little clearer, but I can still see why people get confused a bit when it comes to writing gems, because there's some confusing terminology that gets used in different ways. So let me try and clarify. Well, what's a gem? Well, for anybody outside of this room, it's a precious stone that's probably worth a lot of money. Our Ruby gems maybe not worth quite so much money, but a gem is essentially a packaged library of Ruby code that you can share. But it's also a command line tool that's distributed with the Ruby Gems package manager. And Ruby Gems, as I just mentioned, it's a package manager, but it's also the website that stores all the published versions of gems. So I know these words are going to get a little confusing, and if you're not clear which ones I'm talking about, feel free to just put your hand up and I'll try and clarify, but hopefully it'll be obvious as I go through. But why would you even want to write a Ruby gem? Why do we care? Well, I guess firstly, it's a great way of reusing your own code in different applications that you write, but it's also a great way of letting other people use your code as well, and they get to save some time. And they're really easy to install, well, most of the time, if they don't have C extensions. And they're really easy to share. Now, before I get to the technical side of things, I'm just going to run you through some history. So back in 2003 is when rubyforge.org was registered, and it was set up to share Ruby code. There was no concept of gems at that point. It was just to share Ruby code. But then the following year, the Ruby Gems package manager was created, and the idea of gems started to come into play. And that was great. But to get your code out there, you had to email your gem code to Chad or Rich, which, you know, I'm sure it was a fantastic thing back then, but it was still a little manual and a little far from ideal. So gems were a bit magical. There wasn't a huge amount of documentation back then on how to build them. You had to initially email your code to someone, and then after that, even when RubyForge was set up to distribute gems, you still had to ask for permission before publishing the first version of your gem. Somebody from Ruby Central, so Chad or Rich, had to approve. You submitted a form of saying, this is the name of my gem and this is what it will do, and they had to say, yes, we'll allow that. And generally they did. They weren't that fussy, but it was another manual step in the process. And then 2 years ago, gemcutter.org was released, initially as an alternative source for publishing gems instead of RubyForge, and it made things so much easier. You didn't need permission. All you needed was an account, which you could create yourself, and it made it really easy to publish gems. So easy, in fact, that they decided to make rubygems.org, which was gemcutter, just renamed, as the default gem source. And all the Rubyists were happy. So that's that's how we've come to where we are now. And so let's look at a bit more of the technical side of things. And gems really revolve around gemspecs. Now, a gemspec is just a Ruby file, and you would name it with the name of your gem. So in most of the examples today, I'm going to say Kiv is my gem. I don't know if anybody's already published a gem called Kiv. Maybe somebody here wants to create that. But instead of .rb, the file extension is .gemspec. But the file itself is still Ruby. Here's a very simple example of what it would look like. So you're just going through, making some settings, defining what your gem is. So I'll go through each of the settings listed there and give you some more detail. The name, well, that's pretty obvious. What are you going to call your gem? Now, if somebody else has released a gem with that name, then that's bad luck for you. You've got to find another name. There's no way for two different gems with the same name to exist. And there's no rules, really, around how you name your gem, but there are some recommendations. Firstly, it should all be lowercase. Don't use capital letters. Secondly, if you have multiple words in your gem name, you should separate them with underscores. And so the require statement stays the same, and then you've probably got a class or module of the same name, and you capitalize each word, normal Ruby. If you're namespacing your gem, though, and the good example here is Cucumber Rails, then you use a hyphen or a dash. So in the require statement, that dash becomes a slash, and the modules are namespaced accordingly. Now, these are just recommendations. I know I've actually released gems that don't follow these rules. Nobody's going to, come knocking on your door and, be violent towards you if you don't follow these rules. But it's generally best to follow convention so people don't get surprised and that they find it easier to use your gem. Now, version numbers, again, it's pretty obvious. Most Ruby gems follow the convention of major.minor.release. And if you're not familiar with how each of those numbers work, obviously they have different levels of importance. Major version numbers are the ones you change when something massive has changed in your gem, particularly if you've changed the code that people need to write to use your gem. So if you've done something pretty dramatic, then you want to make this number go up by 1 for the next version. However, if you've just added some features in, it doesn't really require any changes for those using your gem, unless they want to use those new features, but the core stuff remains pretty much the same, then you only really need to increment the minor version number. And then finally, there's the release number, and that's the one you only bump up when you've released some really small changes or some bug fixes, the small things. Now, when you're using other people's gems, it's sometimes useful to know which version of their gem you're using, particularly if you're writing gems that interact with other gems. So I write plenty of gems that interact with, say, Active Record, and I like to know which version of Active Record I'm using just in case there's different behavior. So it's useful to be able to reference that version number in Ruby code. The way I do this these days, and the way I see a lot of other people doing this, is having a constant inside your gem module, and you have it in its own file, and you just set the version number there. And then in your gem spec, you require just that file and you refer to that constant. You do not want to require your entire gem. You could end up with some kind of circular dependencies there, or just lead to headaches in general. So just make sure the version number is in its own file, and you just require it in your gem spec instead of having it referenced both in your gem spec and this file, and you have to change both references all the time. Now, if you want to release a gem that's some kind of pre-release, whether it's a beta or a release candidate or whatever, then all you need to do is put an alphabetical letter in your version number. Doesn't have to be beta, doesn't have to be RC, it can be anything. As long as it's not a number or a full stop, then Ruby Gems considers that a pre-release. And this is useful because pre-releases don't get installed by default. So it's a great way of releasing gems, but not forcing it upon anybody who just does gem install Kiev. They have to explicitly ask for a pre-release version. Author, email, homepage, these are pretty self-explanatory. I don't need to tell you too much about these settings. It's worth noting that both authors and email take arrays, so you can credit each of the people working on the gem, because sometimes it's more than one person. And if you don't have a specific homepage for your gem, and most gems don't, then make sure you put at least the GitHub repository URL in there instead, just so people can go somewhere to find out more information. Now there's summary and then there's description, and they are not the same thing, although they are quite similar. A summary is a really short description of the gem, so maybe 5 or 6 words, something like that. A description is much longer, so you could write a paragraph or two about what your gem does and how it works. If you don't fill either of these out, then you will get warnings when you try to publish your gem. Not errors, just warnings. If you make them exactly the same, you'll also get a warning. So it's worth putting in the extra bit of effort at the start and just distinguishing the two different pieces of detail. Now files is the meat of your gem. This is all, it's a listing of all the Ruby code that makes your gem actually work. So you list all the Ruby files, and you'll also want to list generally a README, if you've got one, and you should have one, and a license. And again, you should have a license file so it's clear to others who are using your gem how it is licensed. Now, I recommend you put all of the code for your gem under the lib directory. You don't have to. You can tell Ruby Gems to look somewhere else, but I've never seen that done in any other gem, and generally there's a good reason for that, and it's just path of least surprise. Put everything in lib. So you'll have a file which is generally matching the name of your gem in there, so kiev.rb. And then every other file that's part of that gem you want to namespace in a directory of the same name to ensure that you don't end up with complications further down the track. So here we have, two classes that are part of our gem, tourist and translator, and you can see that the class names and the paths are both namespaced. Now if you didn't do that, say you put everything just in lib, that would probably work until somebody released a gem called tourist, and suddenly you've got 2 different tourist files in your load path, and you can't be sure which one's going to be loaded. So this is why everything but the actual core file of your gem should be namespaced under lib, and then the gem name. You should always have a README in your project, and I guess that goes for anything that isn't a gem as well. You can use textile or markdown or plain text or RDoc or whatever syntax you want, that's fine. Just make sure there's some information in there, probably about how to install the gem, how to use the gem, perhaps how to contribute to the gem, any limitations, that kind of information. Again, license file. I generally release gems under the MIT or BSD licenses because they're completely open. Some people sometimes use GPL, which means you can't use those projects without permission in commercial projects, which I find is a bit limiting, but whatever you want to use is up to you. You probably want a history file or a changelog file, just documenting all the changes, when they happened, when each gem release occurred. I haven't been doing this up until recently, but I find it extremely useful, and so I recommend it. It's great for yourself to look back and go, oh, that's right, I made that change then, and it was part of this release. Yes. Test files, because you are writing tests for your gem, right? You can use RSpec or test unit or whatever, and you just want to list the test files in your gemspec. So all these paths, and it goes the same for lib as well, are relative to the root of your project. You don't want absolute paths, because that's different on every machine, but just go down to the root of the project. Now, generally you want to put tests in as part of your gem. The one time when you don't is when your tests are really, really large. So I've had cases where I've had a fixture file which is 10 meg of data that's loaded in on every test. Now, I don't want anybody installing my gem to have to download my 10 meg of fixture data as well as the rest of the gem. So in that case, I would make sure those files are not listed in the gem spec. But every other situation, really, your tests are going to be nice and small because they're just text files. So just list them in your gem spec as well. And of course, once you've got all these tests set up, then you probably want to push them out to something like Travis CI, which is for continuous integration and particularly good at testing across different versions of Ruby. So 187, 192, 193, Rubinius, JRuby. I am using Travis CI more and more these days, and it just provides a bit more certainty about where your gem works. Now, a lot of gems have executables, like command line tools like the Rails command, RSpec, Cucumber. If you want something like that for your gem, then you put it in the bin directory and you name the file with no file extension, because the Rails command doesn't have a file extension, and nor do any of the others. So just make sure you name the file like that, and you want to list it in your gem spec. The file itself will look something like this. So we're telling the shell what interpreter to use to process this file, saying it should use Ruby. We're requiring our library, and then we're invoking something from our library, our gem. You really don't want to have any more code than that in your executable. You want to push all that logic into the lib directory where all your gem code is, because it's far easier to test when it's there and far easier to maintain and possibly reuse. So keep your executable files really, really small and push all the logic into your gem code. So that's a basic gem spec, and we've just gone all through the settings there. There's nothing too scary. I do want to cover off a few other things though. First is dependencies, because we all know that some gems require other gems to work. So in your gem spec, you would list those gems as runtime dependencies, and you just give it the gem name and some kind of version constraint. You can also list gems that you use to develop your gem. So these will not be installed when somebody else installs your gem, but they are needed if somebody else wants to, say, clone your gem on GitHub and work on it themselves. So if you've written tests in RSpec, then you want to list RSpec there. And again, same kind of format, it's just a development dependency. Now, these dependency versions, specifying exactly what is a bit of a dark art. I'm still trying to figure out what's best here. But I would recommend for runtime dependencies to generally go with the squiggly arrow. Now, if you're not familiar, and to be honest, I don't even know if that's the widely used terminology. Everybody seems to call it something different. But if you're not familiar with this, it's called the pessimistic version constraint in the Ruby Gems documentation, at least. And it means that the final number you specify can be much higher, but every other number you specify cannot change. So you can see here, we're saying, well, 3.1, so it can be 3 point anything that is 1 or greater, but it cannot be 4.0 or higher than that. And the other example, we're being a bit more specific, so it must be 3.0 point something that is 3 or greater. For development dependencies, I'm usually a bit more exact, just because if somebody else is getting it up and running, I don't want to be uncertain with which versions they're dealing with. I want it to be really simple and just go, right, use exactly this version to work on this gem. Now, you'll probably also have some rake tasks just to help development and releasing, and you put that in the rake file in the root of your project. I'm not going to go through much in the way of examples here, but you probably want something to run your tests and maybe generate some documentation. And your default task, which is named default in your rake file, but is invoked when you just say rake with no arguments, should run your tests. This is certainly what Travis expects, and I've seen other tools that expect this as well. And it's probably the most important task that's part of your gem, so it's a good task to have as the default. So we've got our gem, and the tests are all green, so I guess we can publish it, right? So this, again, it's pretty simple these days because of all the hard work of GemCutter. And there is a gem build command, and you pass that your gemspec file, and it generates the actual gem file for you. And you can see here that it uses the gem name and the gem version, and then the file is a .gem file. Now, a .gem file is just a tar file. If you want to change the file extension, you can to at least open it up and have a look inside. Essentially, there's two pieces of data inside. One is all the code that's to do with your gem, and the other one is just some metadata, which essentially it pulls from the gem spec. You can go exploring if you like on any gem you've got installed, really. But once we've got our gem file, then we want to publish it up to rubygems.org. And that's just a really simple gem, push, and then the path to that gem file you've just built. Now, when you run that, it'll ask you for your username, your email and password from rubygems.org. It will remember those details, so you only really need to enter them once, or perhaps every time you reinstall an operating system. And that's it. It just uploads the file itself, and it's done. Within a few seconds, anybody will be able to install that gem that you just published. Now, those gems that you've put on rubygems.org, they're permanent. You cannot change an existing version of any gem you publish, or any gem that anybody else publishes, for that matter. So if you've found some bugs in a release of a gem, bad luck. Just it's time to release a new version. You can remove versions of gems using the gem yank command, but you shouldn't. The only time you would ever remove a specific version of a gem is when that gem does something terrible, like removes all the files off somebody's computer. Like that's the kind of, if it's not anywhere close to that serious, then just suck it up and just release a new version and don't remove the existing version. Because if somebody has that existing version in their gemfile.lock file, then that's going to cause them all manner of headaches if that version no longer exists. So generally, don't yank, just deal with it. Now, something that's I've noticed recently is that you probably want to publish any gems right now using 1.8 because 1.9 has a different way of parsing YAML, and YAML is used in the metadata in your gem. So sometimes if you publish a gem using 1.9, people installing it on 1.8 won't be able to use it. And you'll just have to publish another version again that fixes this problem. This happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I've seen it happen to plenty of others as well. So you can develop on 1.9, that's fine, but when it comes time to run gem build and gem push, I recommend you use Ruby 1.8. But of course, once you've got it up there, then everybody can start using it. And you probably want to consider a few things as part of that. You'll need to support your gem, or you don't need to, but it's nice to. And just answer people's questions, whether that's via GitHub issues or create a mailing list, or people just ask you questions on Twitter. And also on GitHub, you may see some people fork and then issue pull requests to improve your gem, and that's pretty awesome. Maybe you should have some guidelines on how people should go about contributing in your README. And don't be afraid to curate these patches. So sometimes you'll get a patch and you go, great, yep, love it, putting it in. Sometimes you go, oh, it's not quite right. Don't be afraid to tell that person, look, would you mind if you added some tests? Or, this is great, but I don't think it's going to work in this case. Could you make it a bit more flexible? And sometimes you get a pull request and it's just not what you want at all. Then tell that person that. Don't just leave them there hanging. Just say, look, this may be a great idea. I don't see it happening in my gem though. Maybe you want to create another gem that does this. So be honest but friendly. And as you make changes, you're going to want to release more versions of your gem. And you can do this, I guess, as often as you like, but I would recommend not doing it too often. I mean, for those of us who have been using RSpec and Cucumber for quite some time, we know there's been times when there would be another version of RSpec. It felt like every second day. And it got confusing. You didn't know which version you can use. Can you upgrade? Will the syntax change? What's going on? So it's best just to, be a bit more relaxed about your gem releases and also be clear about what has changed. So again, the history file or the changelog is a great way of doing that, but maybe write a blog post as well. Now, I usually use Bundler in all of my projects these days to define which gems I'm using as part of that project, and I think it's great. And you can also use it to do that for the gems you're developing. And I certainly recommend this, but it's not required. You can use whatever you want. You don't have to use Bundler. And Bundler is only a development tool, right? Your gem file has no impact on the people who install your gem. Gem file as opposed to gemspec. But if you want to use Bundler, then you've got all your dependencies listed in your gemspec already. You don't want to have to list them again in your gem file. And Bundler's cool with that. If you just give it the command gemspec, it reads in everything in your gemspec. Now sometimes you're going to have situations where you need different gems depending on different Rubies in particular. And Bundler is a great way of managing this. And generally it's only a development dependency issue, not a runtime dependency issue. So you can remove perhaps the MySQL2 gem from your development dependencies in your gem spec, and then list different libraries depending on the platform in your gem file. So I've done this one once or twice, and I'm sure there's other situations where, particularly with JRuby, you want to use something slightly different. Bundler can also give you the rake release command, and it does things that you can probably do yourself, like the gem build and the gem push commands, but it also tags that latest commit in your repo with the version number and pushes that tag to GitHub, which is, I think, pretty useful, and it's the one task I use. And you can get that just by putting this line in your rake file. There are other tools out there which are a bit more featured, if you like, than Bundler. Ho has been around for quite some time and is a way of generating the initial project and maybe adding a different testing framework and doing a few other different things to help manage your gem. New Gem builds on top of that, and you can even generate a website for your gem if you really want. Joomla is a bit more pared back than either of those, but again, it's useful for generating the initial directory setup for your gem. But you don't have to use any of these, especially because I just told you what a gem spec is and how to write one, and it's not particularly complex. So I would recommend starting by hand. Just write the gem spec yourself and see how far you can get. And you don't lack for examples, because every gem you've ever installed is an example, and most gems are on GitHub, So you can go look on GitHub and see how they've written their gemspec and how they've structured their files and how exactly they're doing different bits and pieces of their implementation. And also, Bundler comes with the great bundle open command, which opens up any gem you've got as part of your bundle into your text editor. So if you're curious right there of going, oh, I'm using RSpec, how does RSpec do this? Then you can just run bundle open RSpec or bundle open active record and just look straight into the source code of another gem and learn. So that's pretty much all I had to speak about. And I expect you all want to start writing gems right now. But if you do have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you for your talk.
It's okay?
A lot of times I found myself in the following situation. I find the gem I want to use, I include it in gem file. And when I bundle, I get an error because due to some missing native C extension, I get like a error message and bunch of text, and I look for it in Google. I find Stack Overflow answer. Somebody says, oh yeah, just install this library. And then I do it and everything works.
Yeah.
Is there a default place for somebody who wants to use a gem to look which libraries I need to include first before I run into an error and then start looking for it and then I find a solution?
I don't think there's any default place. I would recommend anybody writing gems like that to put it in the summary or description of their gem spec. So it's
Like in README?
And definitely in the README, yes. But sometimes if you're going, oh, I just need that library and I just put it in my gem file, you don't look at that stuff. So I don't, Steve, did you want to add to that?
There's a file called mkmf.rb that they use to build the C extension, and will often have the names of the libraries that you have installed. So that might help you.
Right.
Can you repeat
MKMF.
that, please? With the name of...
There's a file called mkmf.rb that holds all the C extension information. It might help you. It's still not very ultra standard, but it would.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's going to be a part of the gem?
It would be in the source code of the gem.
In the source code of the gem. Okay, thanks.
Hello, Pat. Maybe you know if there are any kind of dependency tracking on rubygems.org, because people still do young gems sometime and that causes problems. So maybe they should have, I don't know, some kind of notification system. Do they have that?
For yanking gems?
Well, when you yank your gem,
Yep.
other peoples who depend on your gem on this particular version, are they notified?
There's no notification, no.
Not yet. Okay.
Yeah, because you don't know who is using your gem, unfortunately.
So they don't track dependencies yet. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but
Hi, I'm Max. Some gems distributed binary commands, useful scripts, and so on. And it would be great to transfer your gem file to native package like RPM or deb. I know there is a topic in internet about tools which could do such work. Have you familiar with this kind of tool, and could you propose something like that?
I haven't used any of those tools, and I've never had to package any gem into a deb or anything like that, RPM. I know that there are great complications with that just because of the way RubyGems handles things and then the way apt or something else handles things. So I know it's not a simple matter, but I haven't had to deal with it myself. No.
Okay, and I have one more question about there is, despite that gem specification is quite simple, there is a bunch of different helpers to like Hoya and so on. do you use some of them, and what if you do, what is your favorite?
I used to use Joomla a fair bit because it wasn't nearly as complex and heavy as, say, Ho. But these days I just use the bundler rate commands and I manage everything else by hand. It's simple enough, and it's actually probably less work that way.
Hey Pat, thank you.
It's okay.
Got a question about the version. Why do you put it in a file by itself rather than in the gemspec?
So
It's just one line.
it's just one line, agreed. But if I'm writing another library that wants to have different behavior depending on that version, then it's useful to be able to check that within Ruby code.
Okay, I see why.
Yeah.
Cool.
Also, I'd like to comment about separate file for versioning. For version. So as far as I know, if I remember correctly, bundler have a command which kind of bumps version. So you do something like gem bump, and then version this separate file will be bumped automatically for you.
Okay. I know Joomla has rate commands that do that as well. But I find it's easy enough to manage myself that I generally don't run a command to do it.
And also I had a question. So have you ever heard of Slim Gems?
I've heard of Slim Gems,
Yeah,
yes.
so there was a huge drama in internet a couple of maybe 4 or 5 months ago.
It was around the time of RailsConf, yeah.
Yeah, so could you please tell more about it?
Okay. So I wasn't at RailsConf this year, so I don't know the facts, but this is my understanding from talking to other people. I may not have the details quite right. I'm sure others will correct me if I get it wrong. But there has been some frustration with the way the Ruby Gems package manager has been changed lately with different releases. And so somebody decided that they would create a different gem package manager called Slim Gems. And I think that was generally kept quiet until RailsConf, and there was a few heated discussions. And so, yeah, some people like Ruby Gems, some people like Slim Gems. In the end, there was like Chad Fowler was trying to get everybody working together and everybody happy. And I think what's happened is that Evan Phoenix, who's particularly involved in Rubinius, is now part of the Ruby Gems package manager team. And he is probably a little friendlier when it comes to dealing with other developers, because the original developers of Ruby Gems are not always that friendly. And so he is helping to smooth things over, and he's managing further releases of the Ruby Gems package manager. So it should be less of a headache next time there are big changes. But I don't know if Slim Gems is still around or whether it's been retired because of these changes. Ryan, you were at RailsConf, is that roughly right?
Cool. So at RailsConf, rather, there was Lawrence Segal who was working on Slim Gems, and a lot of people like Nick Coranto and all that were really interested behind the idea, because Ruby Gems, the people who create Ruby Gems aren't that friendly, I suppose the word is. And so Lauren did this thing, and then Gregory Brown got involved as well, Sea Creature, who created the prawn library, and he consulted with the community and asked, what are the problems you're having? And then he got to the Ruby Gems team and told them, these are the problems we're having. How can we fix it? And Gregory and Evan worked together with the Ruby Gems team in order to improve the Ruby Gems release process. So now, when a new version of Ruby Gems comes out, you shouldn't have a broken Ruby Gems. or it shouldn't break your gems, because they're actually being considerate about these things. You won't have deprecation warnings just because, or you won't have, rather, you'll have deprecation warnings and features just won't be deprecated because they felt like it. There will now be warnings before they're deprecated.
Hi. Can you advise what's the recommended way of building, say, private gems? So, for example, we have some common code which is used in our private internal company applications, and we want to build a gem from this source code. But we don't want all GitHub users to even see our gem.
Yeah.
Is there any preferred way to prevent other people to use our source code and source code of our gem?
I'm not sure if there is a preferred way. I don't know anybody who has something like that set up, but the gem cutter code for rubygems.org is open source. So definitely in theory, and I'm sure people have done this in practice, of setting up their own gem source and publishing the gem to that instead of rubygems.org. But I'm not sure about how you could secure that, because if anybody did find out that gem source name, then they could see what gems are there, but that could be worth looking into and maybe patching it so it's authenticated.
I would like to notice that you could stop your own gem server and use it to publish your gems and inside your company.
Yeah.
I have another question. If you go the gem way and split your system to several gems, there is a problem which you will experience when you change one gem, then you have to install it locally to test your system, and then you find one bug in another gem and you fix it in another gem, and then update your locally installation in this gem, and so on, and it's become very noisy.
Yeah.
Probably you could share some tips how to deal with this problem, and probably some tools which could some kind of use. For example, tracking your changes and make some installation. Probably, I know that's not so hard to write such script by hand, but probably some tools already.
Yeah. So I don't have any scripts, but I will remove, say, a dependency from, so if I'm working on gems that depend on other gems, and I control both of those gems, then I will remove the runtime dependency in the gemspec, and I will add it to my gem file, and you can specify a path option in your gem file, and I will give it a local path to where that project is locally, and then I can work on both, and the changes that I'm making without needing even to commit to Git will be able to be referenced. And if it was somebody else's project, then you could refer to their Git repository instead of a specific version of the gem. So you can use those options in Bundler to just be a bit more flexible. And the same goes if you're working on a Rails app that uses a gem you control, then just change the gem reference in your gem file to a local path. Don't commit that, because it's useless for anyone else, because it's your path. But you can do that just to get to a point where things are working, and then release new versions, or at least release some commits.
Hey Pat, I want to ask, you said that you have to list your test files in gem specification. Are they treated in some special way in Gemcutter or so?
I don't think so. I think it's just useful for anybody to, when they install your gem, to go, oh, there are tests there, and if they wanted, they could run them right there. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, there's nothing really, I think, more to it than that.
Isn't that loaded in your gem file?
Yeah, it will be in your gem as well, yes. It won't be loaded when your gem is loaded, because you control all that anyway via require statements, but the code will be there, yes.
As far as I remember, you have gems that interact with Rails apps, such as thinking things. How do you do testing which involve Rails application? You have to have some Rails app to test some functionality of gem.
I try and keep things as separate as possible. So I don't have a Rails app inside the Thinking Sphinx test suite. Sometimes I will use my local version of Thinking Sphinx to test like rate tasks if I've changed them, because I don't have test coverage on them. But everything else generally works without needing a Rails app to put it all into. So I just have tests that do that. But also lately I've written a gem called Combustion, which is for testing Rails engines or other libraries that are similar to Rails engines. And I've been rewriting Thinking Sphinx and using Combustion to test that rewrite. So that provides more of a Rails application generated on the fly in code, not in files, to test against. So there's also that as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you everyone.
Okay, thanks, Pat. It was a nice talk. I think we need a couple of minutes before our next speaker will prepare himself. So there's a little break.